Chapter 4. It was late, a little before midnight. The unit was quiet as Patricia sat in an upstairs office working on her notes. Mozart played in the background. Her feet were up on the desk as she tried to concentrate on the critical record-keeping she must do. But it was hard. It had been the most exciting day Patricia had spent in years. For the first time, she had come face to face with the embodiment of the reason she'd gotten into psychiatry. She had seen him, looked into his eyes without the hindrance of guards or television monitors or restraints, and she thought she had begun to understand. She forced herself back to the paperwork titled History and Setting. The patient was transferred, she read, from the main building at approximately 15:10 hours, the third day after his arrival, to Unit A-249. He exhibited no aggressive behavior at that time. His attitude was cooperative and helpful. Restraints were deemed unnecessary by Dr. Clemente. Actually, despite the presence of the armed guards, it had all been very routine. Newman was ready when they arrived at the holding area. In fact, he seemed anxious to get to what he called my home away from home. He'd been rational, even-tempered, cooperative, even made a series of jokes about the absurdity of the scene. Parentheses, 3 doctors, 6 armed guards, a couple of orderlies with restraints. Close parentheses. This is how you transfer one of your voluntary friendly patients, he laughed. You gotta call me when you move one of your really disturbed types. That I don't want to miss. The scene had continued to border on the absurd as they marched down the corridor. It was compounded when, for avowed reasons of security, it was decided to walk down the several flights of stairs instead of taking the elevator. On the parade continued, winding its way down the stairs like a many-headed snake. Newman had actually laughed. Don't nobody trip, he called out. Well, I'll be crushed by the pile and I'll get the blame. She returned to her reading. Upon arrival at the unit, the patient asked to remain outside for a few minutes since he was aware that his quarters would be below ground. How the patient obtained this information is currently under investigation. And of great concern, she thought, to several people. Needlessly, she believed. Once he was locked away in the unit, what he knew about it and how he knew it were immaterial. She turned the page. The stoppage of transfer lasted 6 minutes, she continued reading, spent primarily looking at the sky, the woods, appreciating the landscaping in sight. Then the patient indicated he was prepared to enter the unit. It had been an oddly nerve-wracking 6 minutes. They were on the edge of the path that led into the unit when Newman had abruptly stopped, almost causing the guards behind him to collide. So quickly did they jump back to their previously safe distance that the guards in front, not realizing that anything had happened, just kept going. As a result, for almost 30 seconds, Newman stood almost alone. Tension swept through the escorts. The guards quickly recovered, raising their guns to shoulder level. In the tension and confusion of those few seconds, Security Chief Vidal had stepped in, instantly calming everyone. Is there a problem, sir? He'd asked Newman as he moved close to the reputedly dangerous man, face-to-face close. Patricia could still see the pleasantly surprised expression on the former prisoner's face. This was probably the closest that anyone had stood next to him in years. Before I scurry down my hole like a good little guinea pig, Newman had said, I'd like to take a last look around for a few minutes. Breathe some unrecirculated air, smell the flowers, you know. Vidal looked at Clemente and, seeing no objection, he nodded. Of course, sir. Newman stood there, turning slow circles, taking in all the beautiful landscaping of the Institute. Perhaps, Vidal had said quietly, it will not be long before they allow you regular visits to the gardens, then perhaps your full release. Newman had just looked at the man. I doubt it, he finally said. Still, I will pray for that, sir, Vidal had said as they started into the unit. Patricia pulled herself away from the memories and once again continued reading the report. Upon arrival at this quarters, he was given a full tour and a briefing as to the procedures. The only question he asked had to do with the lavatory facilities. He asked for and was granted limited privacy. An agreement in which the lavatory camera would be shut down with the sound remaining active was quickly arrived at. Stupid, she thought as she turned a page. There should never have been a camera in there in the first place. The patient read or watched television sporadically throughout that first afternoon. He ate dinner at 1900, read until 2200, then retired for the evening. She made a note to try and find out what he had watched and read. Monitors noted that he slept evenly and comfortably through the night. The patient arose at 05:30 the next day, performing a series of calisthenic exercises. He showered, shaved, returning all soap and shaving equipment at the prearranged time and without incident. He permitted a medical examination at 0700 prior to his eating breakfast. Physically, Newman was getting stronger every day. His weight was still below normal, but climbing steadily. His strength and reflexes had improved to the point where they were classified as normal. Even his skin color was improving despite the artificial lighting. Another note reminding herself to see that Newman received at least 2 hours of sunlight a week, beginning as soon as reasonable. Dr. Nelwyn arrived at the unit at 06:15, the last page of the report read, and observed the aforementioned prior to entering the patient's quarters at 08:30. She watched him, looking for any signs, no matter how small, of a deep neurosis. Overwashing of his hands, a need to be particularly neat or sloppy, the slightest tick or variable that might give her a direction to go, but there was nothing. The interview, the report continued, was conducted in the patient's quarters living room area. The following is a complete transcript of that first interview presented without comment, and it was signed Dr. Jonathan Clemente, Director, Behavioral Research. She turned the page. The transcript ran over 60 pages. Every word, every sound had been recorded and carefully reduced to this paper record. Tomorrow it would be circulated among the project staff for comment. Tonight, however, it was her chance to match her personal feelings about what had happened with the dry written record. Taking a sip of club soda and grape juice, she began to read. Dr. Nelwyn entered at 08:32. Standing outside the door, waiting for the guards to position themselves, she was filled with the same tremulous emotions she'd felt the first time she'd made love. She wet her lips, checked her hair, interesting parallels to that night, and signaled for the door to open. She stepped inside as she felt the door closing behind her. Newman was standing as instructed, facing away from the door at the entrance to the bedroom. When he heard the bolts thrown, he turned to face her. His expression was, wary. "Good morning," Patricia said in her best therapist voice. "Is it? I wouldn't know, down here in my burrow." Taking a deep breath, she walked over to him, extending her hand. "I don't think we ever officially met. My name is Patricia Nelwyn. I've been asked to help you through all this." Carefully, clearly aware that his every move was being monitored, he reached out and shook her hand. Patricia wasn't sure why, but she felt relieved by the warm, dry grasp. Newman walked past her, settling in an overstuffed chair. "Help me through all what?" Patricia settled herself on the couch. "Well, there's going to be a period of readjustment for you, after all you've been through. We just want to ease that transition." "I see." His voice was non-committal. "How do you feel?" For the first time since she'd seen him on a foggy night near the Czech frontier, he smiled. "Doctor, if we're going to..." He paused. "You are a doctor, aren't you?" "Yes." "What kind?" She smiled, hopefully in a non-threatening way. "I'm a psychiatrist." Newman seemed to be amused by her answer. "Beck must keep you busy." He leaned back in the chair. "If we're going to get along at all, doctor, then I'm afraid you're going to have to expand your horizons beyond basic clinical interviews 101. "In what way?" she asked, noting the arrogant tone. It wasn't forced or put on, but it wasn't natural either. "Don't waste my time with useless pleasantries," he said in the same semi-arrogant, annoyed fashion. "Let's just do what we have to do, and do it as quickly and efficiently as we can." The second reference to speed and efficiency, a clear reference, she believed, to his subconscious fear that she might discover some of his secrets. She felt encouraged. "Don't you like being pleasant?" He yawned as if he were being bored to death. In fact, Patricia believed, he was as anxious to pump her for information as she was him. "Doctor, please." "Sorry," she said conversationally, a brief pause. "Do you know why you're here?" He closed his eyes. "Any number of reasons." Such as, offhand, the gamut from your patently absurd declaration of transitional counseling to incarceration pending execution. He said the words so flatly, as if he didn't care whether he lived or died. You think someone wants to kill you? I said it was a possibility. He stretched his legs out in front of him, the image of a man relaxing after a long day. Why would anyone want to kill you? Why does anyone kill? He said in a near whisper. I haven't had any experience at it. Maybe you could enlighten me. He opened his eyes, inclining his head to look over at her without sitting up. In my position as an expert? His voice had changed again, become narrow, low, threatening. Patricia worked to keep the effect of this new, somehow deadly voice out of her own. Are you an expert? Let's see, he sat up, seeming to think the question over. I'm a practitioner, let's leave it at that. So? Newman smiled as he looked at her, a smile that showed all his teeth, charming and unnerving at the same time. A casual practitioner such as yourself would cite any number of justifications, but that's just delusional self-effacement. She made a show of writing the phrase down. Delusional self-effacement, that's a new one on me. He suddenly seemed bored again. He leaned back, closing his eyes again. You ought to keep up on the literature. What does it mean? She said, in a who-cares voice. Two could play this game. She understood what was going on was a battle for control of their therapeutic relationship. If she tried too hard, begged him for answers, she would quickly find herself in a position of weakness. And that she reminded herself she could never afford, not around Newman. It worked. Newman sat up again, and now he was starting to use his hands when he talked. He was being lured out of his primary defenses. You kill, he said in a professorial voice, but you justify it as necessary at the moment of the act. Even though it secretly makes you feel good, you offer explanations such as, I would have liked to avoid it, but... She cut him off. That's the second time you included me. Do you think I'm a killer? We're all killers, Doctor. He stood up and began moving around the room, not agitated, but as if motion helped him talk. You ever swat a fly, step on a bug, drown your piano teacher? He said as he flipped through a book. I took accordion, Patricia said lightly. He put down the book with the look of genuine distaste on his face. Figures. So, she said, smiling at him, the killing of a fly is equivalent to the killing of a man? He suddenly froze, showing her yet another face, or a woman. His expression was purely predatory, purely primal. He looked her over in a clearly sexual way, then instantly the face was gone, replaced by the bored, smiling mask. But she had seen it. How so? He shrugged. A fly lives, breathes, procreates, has consciousness, has purpose. Your rolled-up newspaper takes all that away with considerably more pain and mess than a lamp cord wrapped around the throat. So, she said while making a note, you hold all life on an equal footing, all equally dear. All equally fragile at any rate. He collapsed back into the chair, seemingly exhausted. You ought to use a little lotion on that, he said casually. Patricia was looking at her notes. Excuse me? That dry spot on the inside of your left breast, he said simply, where you're not wearing your usual, more restrictive discount house bra. He smiled. It was a genuinely charming but also leering act, and thank you. Patricia straightened suddenly, her hand failing to appear casual as she checked her buttons. I'm glad you approve, she said in truth, as well as in an attempt to conceal just how flustered she really was. So, she forced out a moment later, why would anyone want to kill you? He held up his hands and clapped slowly. Very good, he said. He sat up grinning. Very good, Doctor. I was afraid you'd forgotten your question. Do you have an answer? Well, hypothetically, of course. Of course. He rubbed his mouth with his right index finger as he thought it over. They would give one of three possible justifications, I imagine. He paused, but they would all be lies, you understand? Go on. First, they might say I committed capital crimes back in the States prior to my last assignment. They might say that these crimes weren't discovered until after I was beyond their jurisdiction and reach. They would then contend that the proper punishment, therefore, is death. But wouldn't that require some form of a trial prior to your execution? She sounded genuinely interested. Newman was clearly enjoying himself. He sat forward on the edge of the chair, eyes wide open, nodding as she talked. Maybe. Then again, maybe that's why I'm here, for some form of accident to happen, to save the cost and embarrassment of a trial. Go on. Second possibility, they claim that I'm a danger to the community and should be killed for the public good. And, Patricia said softly, he was on a roll and she didn't want to say or do anything to slow him down. Third possibility, he said eagerly, they might execute me as part of a secret deal with the Russians. You just lost me, she said with honest curiosity. If the Russians wanted you dead, surely they would have just killed you in your prison cell? He shook his head. It would have been politically insensitive for them to kill me, and the Russians are very sensitive to that kind of politics. He held up a finger in triumph. But for my own people to do it on their behalf, that's possible. That's the kind of dialectic they appreciate. He leaned back in the chair, keeping his eyes on hers. His every muscle, every look said, aren't I smart? Smarter than anyone you've ever known. Smarter than you. She ignored him. But none of those would be the real reason, she said flatly. No. The arrogance dropped away, nothing so dramatic. Which brings us back to my original question. I forgot it, he said, reassuming the half-asleep pose. What would the real reason be? Why would they want to kill you? Oh, he said, that question. He seemed to be waiting for her to say something, do something, but she just sat there, patiently looking at him, waiting. Newman sighed deeply. They would want me killed for the same reason you kill a fly, he paused. It makes you feel good to be rid of an annoyance. And you think this is what's going to happen? She asked softly. He sat up so suddenly that she jumped. He smiled at his second small triumph over her. Not really. Why would they want to kill me? They're the good guys, right? His voice was happy, filled with false hopes and submerged anxieties. He paused as he watched Patricia quickly recover herself, but it is an interesting speculation, don't you think? So, why are you here? She asked, covering her nervousness by making a note. Newman folded his hands in front of him. He appeared to be deep in thought. When he spoke, his voice was somehow disconnected from his body, as if speaking somehow intruded on the thought process. It would be pure speculation on my part, he said after a while. I wouldn't want to take up your time. We have plenty of time, she said gently, sensing they were near some kind of admission. Can I have your word on that? He paused. Just kidding. His voice and humor were strained. If you can't think of an answer, we can move on, she gently prodded. He stood up, quickly moving back toward the bedroom, picking up a magazine as he went. Excellent, he said in a sarcastic tone. Challenge the patient. Superior clinical technique, doctor. My congratulations. She ignored the tone. Why do you think you're here? He stopped in the bedroom doorway. I suspect that something's gone very wrong with the program, he said, with a tinge of sadness and something else. Worry or self-concern, maybe. And I'm here, he said slowly, for you to find out what and try to fix it. Interesting. Wait till you see my card tricks, he said, as he walked into the bedroom. Exhausted, Patricia closed the file. There was so much going on in Newman, so many contradictory, mutually exclusive patterns. She would laser in on one, think she was getting close to the thread that might lead to an answer. Then up would jump some other complex or neurosis or unidentifiable thing that would shoot that theory to hell. She slipped her feet back into her shoes and stood up. She had hoped that a clinical rereading of the transcript would enable her to seize that thread, to ignore all others and follow it to the root cause, but here she was, less than a third through the transcript and more lost than ever. As she tucked her blouse back in her skirt, uncomfortably conscious of the expensive designer bra she was wearing, she thought about the two conclusions that she was sure of. Newman was an intelligent game player, skilled with at least some psychoanalytic knowledge. Conventional approaches wouldn't work on him. She would have to come up with something new. Let Jack Clemente pound against the reinforced front door of that formidable fortress Newman had constructed. She would somehow slip around the back and try to climb in a window. Second, and most important of all, Newman was a highly dangerous man. Not unstable, not an unpredictable neurotic, not even unbalanced. Hell, the man seemed to maintain his equilibrium no matter what angle you approached him from, like a cat. No, he was dangerous in the most dangerous of ways. He was a man who had simply decided, either through rational consideration or irrational leaps of illogic, that the rules of society simply didn't apply to him. Thus, liberated from accepted concepts of right and wrong, he was capable of anything. As she rode the elevator down, a new, even more disturbing concept echoed through her brain. If, as theorized, Newman had merely decided, after considering all the alternatives, that he would play by his own rules and not society's, if he was capable of living his life in a completely remorseless, hedonistic existence, was he really mentally ill? Or was he something new, some sort of new man that so terrified society that it demanded he be burned at the stake? As she walked to her car, her mind awash with these and other unnerving thoughts, she forced her mind away from the logical next question. What if Newman isn't the only new man out there? Arriving home, she put in video cassettes of Disney cartoons to banish the thought from her mind, at least enough to let her sleep, but late that night, unbidden, the question returned. The morning sessions were also very much on the mind of the man who appeared to be sleeping in the subterranean patient quarters of Unit A-249. Newman lay in the bed, dressed in sweatpants and a t-shirt, eyes closed, his breathing deep and regular. The room was silent except for the periodic, barely heard whir of the bedroom camera's lens as it pushed in for a closer look. It observed him roll over, fully loose and relaxed in a deep, cleansing sleep, exactly as he intended. For 2 hours now he had lain there, eyes closed, gradually slowing his breathing. He'd started in a near-fetal position, gradually allowing his body to unkink itself. A tiny bit of drool slowly stained the pillow cover as he adjusted his breathing to the deep, autonomic breaths associated with deep sleep. It was difficult, painstaking work, but he'd had 6.5 years to perfect the technique. He left one bare foot sticking out the side of the blanket, occasionally twitching to some dream stimuli. He allowed his hair to fall in front of his face, his shoulder to lie at an awkward position, and added just the slightest flutter of his eyelids. He heard the camera whine as it pulled back to a normal, wide shot of the room, the unseen watcher having been convinced that Newman was dead to the world. Only now, after 2 hours of carefully establishing his night cover, did he allow his mind to turn back to the problem at hand. Escape. The hours spent in the holding area had been instructive. From his upper floor window, he'd been able to see most of the rear area of the Institute, including the building he was now housed in. He'd watched the casual patrols of the staff security, seen which lights came on, when, and how much was actually illuminated by them, but he had not been able to answer the most important question. How deep were the woods to the rear of the Institute, and were they fenced off or not? But his actual transfer had answered other questions. The compacted earth paths that connected the buildings were strictly portal to portal. They didn't go through the gardens or woods. The lawn, seemingly so flat and manicured, was actually neither. Close up, it was immaculate, tight, closely cropped in relatively level hard soil. But as you moved farther from the main building, its surface became slightly more uneven, the soil looser and softer. When they'd stopped, quote-unquote, to smell the roses, he'd actually felt his foot sink slightly in the soft grass. Then there were the distances involved. The first were long, but the most exact, having been carefully paced off by Newman whenever they'd moved him. 61 meters for the width of the unit, 250 meters from the main door of the unit to the rear door of the main building, 90 meters for the width of the main building. Now came the estimates. He pulled his foot back under the covers, adjusted his head on the pillow away from the drooled-on spot. all with the spasmodic, retarded action of a person still in a deep sleep. Upon pulling into the front gate of the Institute, they'd averaged about 5 miles per hour for the 42 seconds it took them to arrive at the main entrance. 93.75 meters, better figure 95. By estimating the length of the main building as approximately 325 meters, noting that the unit seemed to approximately align with the center of it and that it extended approximately halfway to the east fence. His lips moved slightly as he did the calculations. The orderly on duty noted it. Subject appears to be talking in his sleep, although contents remain too indistinct for ambient microphones to record. 312 meters to the east fence from the unit, better figure 315. The process was repeated for the west fence. 187 meters, figure 190. The distance from the back of the unit to the woods was trickier, the ground more uneven, and he'd never gotten a direct line view, but it seemed to Newman it was just over twice the length of the unit itself. 122 meters, 125 to play safe. And there was still the question of how deep the woods were and what lay beyond them. But enough had been accomplished for the time being. He now knew exactly how long it would take him to reach any given point on the grounds from the main door of the unit. In optimum conditions, running at 6.1 meters per second, approximately the speed of a slow college sprinter. Again, his lips moved, and the technician in the observation room made the same notation as earlier. To the main gate, 1 minute 9 seconds. To the east fence, 52 seconds. To the west fence, 31 seconds. To the woods, 21 seconds. Satisfied, he rolled over, physically and mentally, to a new position and new problem. How to get to the main door of the unit? A straight force approach was out. Too many guards, too many locked doors, too many cameras. Not to mention the problem of the elevator. No. He would have to get them to allow him out of the unit. At that moment, lower their vigilance, lull them to sleep, and buy 5 minutes of free unencumbered time. But how to do that? The answer was as obvious as the winding of the lens as it pushed in and pulled back. They would have to want to do it. He began to evaluate those members of the project staff that he'd been able to observe close up. Clemente was a traditional shrink, his techniques tried and true. He was cautious, experienced, conservative. He was consigned to a back burner. Now, she was interesting. Far less confident than she pretended, but also was the sharpest of the bunch by far. He dominated their interview earlier, but she'd allow him to dominate, and that was intriguing. He suspected she was probably a good shrink, but underappreciated. She tended toward the unconventional, seemed a little excitable, but intelligent, sharp, and perceptive. But in her eyes, Newman could see that she also, with all her heart and soul, wanted not only to be right, but to display her rightness, and there was one more thing besides. Dr. Patricia Nelwyn, beneath her cool and professional detachment and nice party manners, believed herself to be a chrysalis, an ugly caterpillar on the verge of becoming a beautiful butterfly, yet somehow unable to ever pull it off completely or for any length of time. So she spread her multicolored wings only in her mind. But if she were to see someone else see her as a butterfly, front burner for her. The security chief Vidal was essentially basic, probably a career soldier or police. He seemed tough, honest, brave, and unfortunately for him, compassionate. Front burner, but toward the rear. Newman would have to remind himself to reread the Bible. That's where the key to Vidal was. Finally, for the 100th time since his release, he turned his attention to the one person he thought he could most easily manipulate into inadvertently helping, Alexander Beck. Beck's guilt was obvious and unhidden. The man seemed like a porcelain doll that had been dropped one too many times. Riddled with hairline, barely visible cracks, he was held together by force of will, discipline, and routine. His need, his button waiting to be pushed, was for a complete, soulful forgiveness. He was a child begging for mommy or daddy to kiss it and make it all better, who would do almost anything to achieve that moment of peace and contentment, but Beck was also an unknown. Beck knew almost everything Newman knew. had taught him much of it in the first place, and while his conscience and morality wouldn't allow him the freedom of action that Newman had, if Beck calculated that the gain was greater than the cost, he could be just as effective. But Beck had to do the mental gymnastics. There was no question, Newman thought as he allowed sleep to slowly rise from within him. Beck was the weak link. Find a way to turn the key in Beck, and the door to the unit would fly open. After Beck, there was Noah, and then possibly Edel. 3 doors, closed, locked, but all vulnerable to the same human key. Then he was asleep. It was almost 3 o'clock in the morning. Outside it was cold and misty. The security guards on patrol pulled their collars up as they walked, heads down, along their assigned route. At each checkpoint they stopped, pulled out their radios, and gave the appropriate sign. Along the east fence, midway between the main gate and the woods, they repeated the procedure. Patrol 7 at Point Echo 3. Patrol 7, roger. The reply came through the light static. Show 0256, confirm. 0256, roger, proceeding to Point Echo 4. They continued on, talking about an upcoming soccer match. Never once did they notice the malevolent shadow that moved up to take their place. The shades seemed to settle there for a moment, as if waiting for the 2 men to move farther along before deciding which direction to proceed. After 5 minutes, it slid soundlessly across the lawn to the west. At a point very near the main building, it settled into the ground again. It waited there, a barely visible something, watching as the nurse and 2 orderlies walked down the path to the parking lot. 3 minutes later, it was on the move again. Across the back of the main building, stopping at the west fence, moving north toward the woods, the fence at its right. Unit A-249 on its left, it came to a noiseless stop. It stayed there, no movement, sound, or other indication that it existed, merely the slightly darker darkness of itself against the total dark of the grounds in that isolated spot. 20 minutes later, with the sound of the 2 guards approaching from the woods area, it moved. Suddenly and silently, it glided directly toward the unit, coming to a stop just outside the periphery of the surveillance cameras. There it remained, frozen, immobile, detached from its surroundings, yet a part of them. A desolate, menacing nothing, with a clear view of the main entrance to the unit, the lawn between the unit and the main building, the lawn between the unit and the woods, and the lawn between the unit and the east fence. And its mast stood between the unit and the west fence. It remained through the night as it would for many nights to come. It stood its black post without complaint or relief or explanation until 20 minutes before sunrise, when it roused itself and moved stealthily into the woods. 5:30 in the morning. Patricia's alarm jangled loudly. She merely reached over, switching it off. She'd been up for the better part of an hour, reading. No matter how many cartoons she watched, how much elevator music she assaulted herself with, thoughts of Newman could not be pushed completely from her consciousness, so she had returned to the transcript. Subject returned to the living area, she read, after remaining in the bedroom for 11 minutes, apparently reading. Patricia knew this was a test. Newman expected to be left behind, to be abandoned as he felt he had been in Russia, so to avoid that pain, he would do the abandoning, be the first to leave. And if she was right, Patricia thought, she must remain there however long it took for him to return. Still here? He asked affably as he returned his magazine to the table. Yep. Newman turned on the music system. He tuned to a channel of soft rock, keeping the volume down low. I suppose you have a reason. She nodded. I want to help. He raised his eyebrows. Why? This was the one question she hadn't prepared herself for. Luckily, she didn't have to answer. I mean, Newman said as he collapsed back into the chair, I know you must be getting a ton of money from Uncle. He paused. How much am I worth, by the way? He sounded genuinely interested. They don't tell us peasants things like that, she said with a smile, but it must be quite a bit, don't you think? Why? Now he seemed to be off balance. Patricia continued conversationally. Well, not to sound egomaniacal, but our institute doesn't come cheap. Add in the number of people that have been assigned just to your care, and it stands to reason that somebody must care about you one heck of a lot. Not me, the program, he said after due consideration. Would they really go to all this length, she said with a smile, give themselves this much exposure if all they cared about was the program? You don't know them, so educate me. A long pause developed between them, so long that Patricia began to believe she had gone too far. Do you know anything about sharks, Doctor? Great white sharks? His voice was so quiet, so subdued and out of character that she had to strain to hear it. Not much, he nodded. Carcharias is their scientific designation. They're solitary creatures. No one knows how long they live, or how they live for that matter. All they do is swim, eat, and procreate. She nodded, suppressing her exultation at getting Newman to open up about his feelings toward himself. Clearly, the great white shark, the most feared terror of the oceans, was an analogy for himself. Go on. His expression was far away. Put an injured fish in the water, pour 1/10 of a liter of blood in a choppy sea, and the great white will sense it from as far away as 100 miles. They'll navigate flawlessly around or through any obstacle to get to it. When it arrives on the scene, despite its size, power, and obvious advantage, it waits, circling until it's sure that its prey can't put up a fight, can't resist. Only then does it strike, usually from behind. What better metaphor than that for what Newman had become, Patricia thought. The predator who, despite overwhelming superiority, still waits for its eventual victim to become defenseless. She fought the desire to make copious notes of this psychic unveiling. Yes? Newman nodded. Now, 15 million years ago, there was an ancestor of the great white. They call it Carcharodon megalodon. It was as much as 10 times larger than the ones we know today. They found the fossilized tooth of one once. It was bigger than your hand. Unconsciously, Patricia looked down at her hand. Newman either didn't notice or ignored her. If it were still around today, and there is speculation about whether or not it is, it could swallow a small boat whole. Nothing could stand in its way. He paused, chuckling bitterly, let alone a little wounded fish. She nodded gravely. And you feel that through your personality and training, she said in an academic voice, you have become this megalodon, this unstoppable leviathan. Of course, as always happens to the monster from the deep, you expect that those who created you now fear you and must kill you. She paused. I understand. Newman stood up and wearily shook his head. I'm afraid not, Doctor. He took a deep breath and headed for the bathroom with heavy legs. The megalodon, what I was describing, are the people I work for, the government, yours and mine. He paused again. Me? I'm just a wounded fish.